My name is Mike Morris, co-director of Writing on the Wall, one of the person who organised the George Garret Archive project. I'm one of the editors of 10 Years on the Parish by George Garret. Welcome to everybody here tonight. This is a part of the Writing on the Wall Festival, WildFest 2017, which this year very appropriately is themed Revolution. We are just about 2 weeks into our festival, which is a month-long festival, and I would invite you to check out the brochures and see what else is happening for the rest of the month, and you'll all be welcome to come along. Although you'll get to see him tomorrow night, I'm going to embarrass him. Phil Strayton's here tonight, who the Hillsborough documentary won a BAFTA last night. It can't go without passing. It's also a shameless plug for Phil, who's here tomorrow night speaking at Blackburn House about recovering truth, which is obviously part of Hillsborough, but part of Phil's long-term work, which you will get to find out a bit more about tomorrow night if you want to come along. I'm also going to get some thanks in early. Obviously, thanks to Waterstones tonight for hosting this event, and thanks to Liverpool University Press for the work that they've done on preparing, which we all feel is a beautiful publication that really does justice and honour to the work of Garret as well. We want to say a special thanks for somebody who we did miss out from the thanks in the book itself, which was the Manchester Geographical Society, who gave us some money to help transcribe the book itself, which was very welcome at the time. There's lots of thanks within the booth, which you will see. I also want to thank the Writing on the Wall staff, Madeline, and all of our staff who've given us great support on this and part and parcel of the campaign. And also the Garretteers, quite a few of whom are here tonight. So we have Will Reid and Sue Smith and Ray Corliss and Sean Garrett, and who else is from Rochelle Ellis at the back, Hannah Holmes, who can't be here tonight, and there's a couple of people, Sheila Garrett, Anne McDermott, and others who've been absolutely key to this project and to recovering the archive, to putting it into Central Library, preserving it for the future, and bringing about this publication of 10 Years on the Parish. The format tonight is I'm going to be speaking, first of all, I'm hosting, but I'm going to speak as well to introduce tonight, and then we're going to have the other editors, which is Andy Davies, who's sitting here, is a political geographer lecturer at Liverpool University, and also Tony Wailey, who is a writer, educationalist, lecturer, etc., who've all been key to this at different stages, key to this. I was looking back, Facebook is quite a good reminder actually. It gave me a reminder that there was an event we had Writing on the Wall called Working Class Heroes, which was almost to the day, I think it was 2010, 2011, when, and so I'm going to tell you a little bit of the story of this book, when Tony Wailey spoke at an event called Working Class Heroes, and he mentioned, as part of a number of writers, including James Hanley, he mentioned George Garret and talked about George Garret. And when we came away, Madeline, who's the other co-director of Writing on the Wall, said, my cousin, Mike Garrett, keeps on talking about his granddad and that he's got this suitcase of material of Garrett's, and he says it's got archive stuff of George's in there, so we should meet him, and it feels like almost immediately, it was probably a day or so later, we actually bumped into Mike Garrett, appropriately enough, on the steps of the Casa, where we were going to another Writing on the Wall event. We arranged to meet him. To cut a long story short, we met him in Peter Gavana's. There's lots of pubs involved in this in this project, and we met him in Peter Gavana's, and him and his wife brought along two suitcases. A suitcase first of all of archive material. This was then followed by a suitcase a little bit later on that also contained the material, which just opened up an absolute treasure. And we thought the campaign, after I keep calling it a campaign, it is a campaign in many ways, but we thought it might be over quite quickly. But after we'd done the Heritage Project, maybe 18 months, but it hasn't stopped, and one of the reasons for that is the depth and quality of Garrett's work and the amount of connections that you develop through Garrett as you chase him down. Because one of the things is, where do you find Garrett? Frank Cottrell Boyce, in a brilliant foreword to the book, and Frank Cottrell Boyce did the foreword because his dad, Frank Boyce, and his mum, Joan, both been involved in the Garret Archive. Frank Boyce was writing about George Garret many, many years ago. And Frank Boyce makes the point you have to be a bit of a detective in order to try and find Garret and to try and trace him. Because, and words are important with Garret, and names are very important with Garret. In the book for On the Parish, he is down as a groundling. That's how he signs the book. And a groundling was the people who paid the penny to get into the pit of the Globe Theatre back in Shakespeare's day. They were the apprentices, they were the smelly people, they were the lowest of the low, as the people on the higher tiers regarded them. He used the name matelot, a play on the French word matelot for sailor, when he wrote many of his short stories. He was George Oswald James when he was in America. He was G. Tarrag on other things as well. Names are important. He named one of his sons Eugene after Eugene O'Neill. He named another son Wesley after Wesley Everett, one of the martyrs of the IWW, the Industrial Works of the World, the Wobblies, that Garret was a lifelong supporter of, a member and organiser for in the very early days. And so you can see with names like that, well, how do you find them? And one of the things has been, for example, George Orwell didn't know that Garret had published something like another 6 stories under the name of Matt Lowe when he met him. So even he who met him and knew didn't have a full understanding of the amount of work that Garret had done. So where'd you find him? Well, we have a book which says it's the Garret's autobiography and it's his letters. But I can't claim that you will find everything about Garret even in this book. There's many places I think you have to look, and we're going to try and explore that between the three of us tonight. One is obviously Liverpool, the other is New York, but in reality, Garret is all at sea. And, thanks Helen, that's my part. That was a friendlier laugh than I normally get. He's all at sea. Because Garret does play this role of movement, of transgression, of crossing borders all the time and carrying ideas. I'm not going to go into that much detail because Andy will do that. And Tony will talk much more about Garret when he is in America. One of the most key things to Garret and one of his formative influences that he had in his life, and the way that he was able to connect creatively and his own creativity and discover his creativity and bring that back to America as well. Because one of the things that many people didn't know until we brought this archive to light was that he wrote 3 plays, one of which we think was written in Liverpool, but 2 were written and registered in New York, which for a non-scholarly educated and certainly not theatre trained working class seaman is an astonishing feat in anybody's book, and in and of itself that would be worthy of a study of Garret. There are many aspects to Garret, and one of the things that we've pointed to has been his contemporary nature. We launched this book with the festival the other week on May Day. And the story of that is that we, a cultural organisation, decided to launch the book. We'd have a May Day parade. And we brought together the Northwest TUC, the Trades Council, a whole bunch of organisations and individuals. And it was very, I think, very striking that is something I think Garret would have approved of, because that's what Garret was about all of his life, was of trying to bring unity. He worked for the Reconciliation Society against sectarianism. He wanted, the idea of the syndicalists, one big union. He was able himself to bring together a number of aspects of his own life and his own interests. And in the book, one of the greatest scenes is when he describes the Hunger March. And just to give you a very brief recap, so I'm looking around and think there's people here who don't actually know that much about Garret. We've been so absorbed in it that you feel, that everybody knows. Born in 1896, goes to sea when he is the age of, 15. He tramps around Argentina for a year. He comes back in 1914 and signs on for the war. He's then a stoker right throughout the war. He's torpedoed and sunk twice. He is captured by the Germans on a destroyer. He's interned, he escapes, he comes back after the war, he marries, he embarks on a marriage that lasts until his death in 1966 and has 7 sons. He then goes to America for a year in 1920 to 21, where he's involved in major industrial disputes. He comes back, he leads the unemployed marches around the city centre, he's arrested outside the Walker Art Gallery. He then goes and leads the 1922 Hunger March. After that, because he knows he's still blacklisted, he then goes back to America, and he lives in America for 3 years. And he goes to America this time to write. And we have his notebooks, we have the cuttings that he takes from books and magazines, and the studies that he does in poetry, in literature, as he is in America. He lives with 3 future Hollywood actors. And the plays that he writes, and they're in the archive, are in solid card-bound folders. And they are working plays, and we have letters from theatre saying, you know, your manuscript's ready to pick up. So he's a working writer. There's no doubt that his work was read and was discussed, and maybe, you know, rehearsed readings. We've got no evidence that he would perform, but that's what he does when he's in America. And then, again, this is reminiscent of today, when it becomes American jobs for American workers, and the immigration raids are hitting every factory and on the streets. He comes back to the UK. And he comes back literally at the end of the 1926 general strike. And his description was when, and this was Garrett's kind of talent, was in one short phrase to capture something that other people might spend you know, a whole book trying to describe. And he says, when the policemen and the strikers were playing football together. And the point that he makes is, this is the lethargy. This is a return back to normal. This is the end of the general strike, and the end of a major movement, and one which John Lucas, who another person who played a great role in recovering Garrett, an academic from Nottingham Trent University, said that a lot of people look at the 30s and look at 1929, the great crash. This was already coming when Garrett come back, and John Lucas makes the point that the 1926 general strike is the thing that then colours the rest of the decade. And really we find the 30s in the late 20s really, around 1926, and that defeat of the working class, which for Garrett means 10 years of unemployment, 10 years on the parish. Because at that point, it was the local parish councils that paid. And so in that moment then is where he kind of finds another voice. He starts out writing songs for marches. He then writes plays, and he does street theatre. And then in the 30s, he begins to write short stories, brilliant short stories. But he finds that in the life that he's living. And the one thing about Garrett, unlike a lot of writers, was his engagement constantly with the people around him. In fact, he actually complains at times that he doesn't have the time to write, because every time he goes to the library for a bit of peace and quiet, men that know him keep coming up and telling him about his problems, because he was also an advocate. He went into the parish councils to argue for other people, whilst he himself, in vivid descriptions in here, is suffering extreme poverty as a result of the conditions that he and his wife and the kids are living in at that point in time. So he has 10 years of unemployment. And what you read in the book is the way that he captures again creatively what he's experiencing, whilst at the same time living a life where he's advocating and fighting on his own behalf, on other people's behalf, and realising that unlike the early 20s, that this is not a time for marches. It wasn't happening at that point in time. And that this was a time where he had to find other ways to express himself. And where every single page kind of quivers with him, trying to find a way to express himself, to bring these stories, to be able to pass this on in many senses. And like any working class writer, to struggle within that to find himself creatively. And he, as he's doing his short stories, he teams up with an editor called John Layman. John Layman was Cambridge, Eton educated, came from a very kind of bourgeois, middle class family. And he couldn't have been further from Garrett if you'd have tried in many senses. He was radicalised by the Spanish Civil War, as many people were. Garrett was too old really to go and fight in Spain, and he had a family to look after. But he helped to found the Merseyside Left Theatre in response to the Spanish Civil War, which then became the Unity Theatre, which exists today. They were out on the street declaiming and, you know, doing theatre acts and all kinds of things across the region. John Layman and a number of other people had set up magazines, and John Layman's stated aim was to try and publish middle-class writers alongside working-class writers, and he did that to great success, actually. And he was a very principled character, John Layman. And so he came across Garrett, and Garrett began to submit material to him, and he sent him the Hunger March 1922 and stuff like that. And so the idea came about of a longer book. Lawrence and Wishart, the original Communist Party publishers, wanted a longer book. And so Garrett kind of embarks upon this. Within something like 2 months, Garrett has written 20,000 words of this book. Within another relatively short space of time, he's written another 20,000 words. He has 40,000 words down. And yet he writes to Layman, "I'm extremely disappointed." Now, Layman would not have had any idea that this guy was going to write this much material. But you can sense with Garrett a kind of urge to get this out. And one of the urges was that he wanted to counter, for example, The Road to Wigan Pier by George Orwell. When that book comes out, I'll see if I can just find the quote. George Orwell, by the way, meets Garrett in Liverpool. Garrett shows him around the city, shows him the housing. They get on very well, actually. They sit up all night talking, but Orwell was seen as a bit of a dilettante, a bit of a almost poverty tourist in some ways by working class writers of the time. And he says that, I'll quote him, "When The Road to Wigan Pier comes out," that Garrett has actually almost advised Orwell on to a degree as well. He writes to Layman, "P.S. That Road to Wigan Pier is a terrible hodgepodge from beginning to end. It is one long sneer. This includes the first part. The only decent material is the visit to the mine and the photographs. I wish I'd been given the job of reviewing it. A book of that type can do a lot of damage. That it should appear as a left book club gives it an added danger." Now it's very interesting. Only somebody like Garrett could really comment at that point about something like The Road to Wigan Pier in the way that he did. But he set out then to write 10 years on the Parish. And he makes a massive amount of headway. And yet we're not convinced that John Layman, the editor, actually sees this, actually sees the final manuscript of 10 years on the Parish. Because Garrett kind of runs out of time. He's working, and the letters, I won't go through them, but the letters that are included at the back of the book here go through and chart his attempts and then his living conditions. And I make the point that whilst this is being written, John Layman lives between, I think, a beautiful family home down south. He also lives in Vienna. Garrett moves from a slum house in the Dingle to a tenement, and then out to one of the new housing estates in Speak. Garrett is desperate for a space to write. Layman's got all the space in the world. And Garrett feels this bearing down upon him. And he, in the end, he has a breakdown, and he writes to Layman, and he says, "Everything snapped. I broke down and landed myself in hospital. I was knocked out all right." And he says, when a man tightened his fingers around his baby's throat, he's reached a pretty dangerous condition. Now, I don't say that in a way for sympathy for Garrett, because he never elicited sympathy for himself. He had a very brief crisis, if you like, as a result of the weight of poverty, of the stress of the conditions that they were living in, but also of his desperation to try and to write and complete this book. And when we came across it in the archive, it was complete. It's fragmented a little bit, but most of it's typed up. Some of it is handwritten, which we had to decipher because his handwriting is incredibly small. I see Will laughing here because he played a big part in doing that. But he achieved it. And he achieved it. When you look back what he achieved in his lifetime, besides the activism and besides the work that he did in defending people, and one just a small example of that, when they're on the march, the Hunger March in 1922, they come across a workhouse where the families are separated by chicken wire, and that the children have to kiss their father through chicken wire before they go to bed. And the guy who runs the workhouse has got no idea that this is in any way objectionable. But him and the other people there, they demand it's taken down, they reunite the families, and they inspire them. So he plays a role in that sense. He played a role in transforming the benefit system in this country as a result of the Hunger March. He played a role in reforming the Seamen's Union as well. But his achievements really are what mark him out far more than just a working class activist, of which we've had many in Liverpool, was his ability to translate that creatively. And what he has laid down here, and in his short stories and in his plays, I think is some of the most remarkable working class writing that we've ever seen in this country. I think you will struggle to find work of this quality and this nature, pitted against the life that he lived as well. So we feel that by bringing this out, that we're not doing just a historical service, that this is not just look at the 1920s, the 1930s, wasn't it bad? What we are doing, and when you consider this has taken us 5 or 6 years to get to this point, Garrett would never have claimed to be Shakespeare, but when you think of the graduates every single year that churn out from Oxford and Cambridge and all these other universities, every single one a thesis on Shakespeare or Keats or all of these people, Garrett has not got scholars. He doesn't have that type of resource and backing. And no wonder this type of work disappears from view when the hand that holds the pen themselves disappears. And so we feel that what we've done here is bring back into the light some of the best achievements of the working class in terms of literature as well. And I think you'll feel the same when you read it yourself. So thank you very much. And now I'm going to hand over to Andy Davies.
Can you hear me fine in this case? I'm paranoid when it comes to these moments. So, what I'm going to talk about for the next 10 minutes or so is some of the aspects of Garrett that the three of us, and I think I can speak for the Garretteers as well, aspects of Garrett's life that we find incredibly important. Part of my research as an academic at the university at the top of the hill is about thinking about how maritime issues and histories of maritime issues are important for our understandings of politics. That's why I'm interested in Garrett. That's why I think he's a really fascinating character, on top of all of the kind of rich stuff that Mike has just said about it as well. So that's the thing about Garrett, I think. You can find, wherever you scratch the surface with him, you can find something that's absolutely fascinating as it goes along. But in a strange way, what I'm going to talk about here is something that Garrett really doesn't actually talk about in the book itself. So probably doing a bad job of selling the book at this point. But it's something that we wanted to do, and what we wanted to include in the introduction to the book, because it's important to understand him through this particular lens of him being a maritime person for a significant portion of his life. So what I'm going to do is quickly think about kind of some broader ideas. I'm lapsing into lecturer mode here at the moment. What I'm going to do is first one thing. So we're going to think about. Sorry, I'm full on lecture. I think it's important to recognise globalisation, this idea that we live in a global world. That's nothing new. One of the things that I think it's important to think about Garrett is he was a global man. Globalisation arguably started in 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. One of the things I always tell students is, at that point, that's when capitalism started. That's when all of the changes that we've seen since that time began to kick into effect. All of the things like imperialism, colonialism, the emergence of industrialisation, all of those things fold out, and Garrett is a really important part of that. And our understanding of Garrett's life is missing something if we don't think about that. So, academically, writing in the early 1990s, the great social and cultural theorist Paul Gilroy came up with a term called the Black Atlantic. What he said was, all of our histories of the Atlantic were white. They were about rich white people, or people like Columbus, going and discovering new places, despite the fact that people had lived there for thousands of years beforehand. You don't get the story of Columbus unleashing genocide and unleashing a wave of huge disruption to settled societies that pre-existed Columbian emergence at that point. Gilroy was interested in kind of the networks of black internationalism that emerged from that, stretching up until the 20s and 30s. And his book is about trying to understand and trying to recover black voices from this time, to kind of say the Atlantic was not just this story of white exploitation, it was a story of black dynamic lives that were equally important in shaping this process as well. So, following up from that, one of the things that we hint at, we begin to talk about a little bit in the introduction, is a later book by two kind of really important thinkers in kind of maritime studies, Peter Langbaugh and Marcus Rediker, where they came up with, or they've been classified as people who came up with what they call the Red Atlantic. In a book called The Many-Headed Hydra, published in 2000, they came up with a history of the long 18th century, this kind of crucial moment of European imperialism emerging at that point. And instead of telling the story of the imperialists and the victors within this story, they began to think about, well, what happened in the Atlantic at this point? What was it like to be a working man on a ship in the 1700s? How can we recover those stories? How can we understand what it meant to be within that? And it's a great book because it goes through lots of short examples of how pirates, the people we kind of think of as the baddies of all of these stories, actually, on many ships, democratically elected their captains. Processes like that, where you had interesting experiments with democratic behaviour that were working out through those spaces that get removed by a focus on the kind of imperial glory of that time. But what they also tell us is the Atlantic, this place, both Gilroy and Langbaugh and Rediker tell us that the Atlantic was a space of violence, it was a space of inequality, and it was a space of hardship. And people were struggling against that. And I think that's the key thing to remember when we talk about Garrett within that as well. And I think, yes, we can talk about that as being, well, it's the 18th century. But what's important is we see Garrett as part of a longer historical trajectory of that resistance. So, class relations were different for Garrett when he was working on steamships, but there were still embedded class relations. It wasn't the same as living and working in the age of sail as the kind of people that Langbaugh and Rediker are talking about. I wouldn't be a proper geographer if I didn't bring a map. So, I took this down off my office wall earlier on today. This is one of my favourite maps. This is. I'll leave it out at the end so we can all come and have a look. So this is a map published by the Empire Marketing Board in 1927. So this kind of gives a sense of what the Empire was trying to sell itself as at the time Garrett was working through these things. You can see, if you come and have a look at it afterwards, all of these connections of trade spreading out from Britain over to India, Australia, all the other parts of the Empire as well. So, one of the things is thinking about, well, these maps tell us about the glory of empire, but they don't tell us about what happened if you were on one of these little lines. There's little pictures of ships floating around here as well. As a maritime geographer, I'm like, oh, ships. So, cheers, Mike. Sorry. So, what happened in those spaces? One of the things that Garrett is brilliant at in his short stories and in some of his other writing is describing what it was like to work in some of these spaces. What was the hard labour of being a stoker actually like? What were the injustices you faced where the ship's captain or the foreman were telling you how to behave? What was acceptable? What wasn't within that? At the beginning of On the Parish, or this version of 10 Years on the Parish, He talks a little bit about stowing away at the beginning. You get a sense of his real hatred of the class injustice that works through that. The fact that all he dreamt of was being able to get out of Liverpool, being able to see the world, being able to see other places, but then immediately on stowing away, finding that he's controlled by certain people. He's not allowed to do certain things, but crucially, some of the other sailors look after him. They share their food with him. They encourage him in certain ways. So there's forms of oppression, forms of inequality, but also forms of solidarity, forms of friendship that help him to bind and help him to feel like he's part of something bigger and something else within that. So we get a glimpse in Tales on the Parish of some of these issues, but what we wanted to do within the introduction was to really kind of push this as important, because there's a danger that George kind of undersells himself in this respect. If you only read this book, you wouldn't really recognise that aspect of his life, which is crucial to understanding how he makes sense of the world. We're not 100% sure why he skips over this. Partially we think it could be because he just kind of took it for granted. It was just part of his everyday life. But it could also have been something that Lehman encouraged him not to write about for the focus on the more Liverpool-centric things. But what's important, I think, if you read the book, is to think about Garrett as this global person. It's about travelling around, it's about experiencing what life is like in other places that helps us understand how Garrett made sense of the world. Once you understand that about him, once you read the book with that lens or with that hat on, you begin to understand how he understood class relations. You understand how he put the broader picture together of trying to resist, trying to get a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, those kind of issues. He has, and I'm going to quote one of my geographical heroes here, Doreen Massey, what she calls a global sense of place. So the book is very much about Liverpool, but it's about Liverpool as a space that is run through with connections to other places. It's as close to Cape Town as it is to Lancaster in many ways. Those kind of connections, those solidarities, those ideas that he picks up from New York, which Tony will talk about in a second, are the key thing. So I'm going to try and finish up here and allow Tony to say a bit more. But the key thing, I think, is seeing Garrett as part of this red Atlantic, and not a red Atlantic that is in the 18th century. The red Atlantic that carries on through, that keeps all of those kind of social, political trajectories functioning through that record. And so George is part of an Atlantic world that stretches from Liverpool to other parts of the world closely. And that puts him really importantly in part of an Atlantic world that goes back to 1492 but carries on today. We don't have to go very far from here to find out about labour struggles in the maritime sector, which are happening right now. That kind of radicalism is still very important within a lot of these issues. So, on that note, I'll hand over to
Thank you.
The last two speakers to bore you for an hour. Which I won't.
Use the mic too.
Yeah, use the mic.
Shall I use it?
Yes.
Oh, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. If you look at the booth and the picture of the booth, you'll see a rather hard-looking character staring out of you, straight up from the stokehold. Picture taken in probably about 1917. One of the pictures I wanted to use was of a much more upright, shining New York cap on bleacher boy in the latest style of New York. I was wrong because that picture is much more fitting for the actual work itself. But the bleacher boy that you'll just have to imagine, and you've probably seen somewhere in your travels, is what Garrett was about. Garrett was always about New York, the way hundreds of thousands of particularly Liverpool seamen, and don't forget, when we talk about seamen, 177,000 sailed out of this port in 1911. So it's a cosmopolitan sort of universe that Garrett inhabits. He loved New York, and the thing that he loved most about New York was the notion of democracy, ground root democracy. And just to sort of give you an idea of that, just at the time when Garrett goes to New York first, as in 1917, 1918, and spends some time there, there's a movement of literature called the Ghetto Pastoral, associated with the writers Michael Gove and Ira Lewin and a number of others. And their central tenet was literature can be produced anywhere. Garrett took to this like a fish to water. He didn't start writing until, as Mike sort of said, until he went back formally to New York, jumped ship again, and stayed as a subterranean for 3 years till 1926. But New York appealed to him the way it's appealed to so many other Liverpool scene, as being this, not only this brash, rather curt sort of city, but one that prided itself on having an art and culture from below. And I think that's the central point to remember about Garrett. He doesn't refer to it much in the book, except as a passing aside, and as like Andy said, almost as if you take that as read. And why should you not take it as read? Everyone had been to New York in the dockside parishes from Dingle up to the North End. The Ghetto Pastoral was important, but also the politics of New York. We've seen Mike talk about the Wobbly movement, the industrial workers of the world, formed by James Connolly and various others in 1905. Garrett took again to this like a duck to water. And why? The whole central tenet of the Wobblies was that industrial struggle and cultural production are just two sides of the same coin. So it's not just a bread and ashes sort of type of socialism, but it's the socialism of a carnival as well. That you can have street theatre, you can have almost active events that have a cultural significance wider than the industrial base in which they're taking place. And of course, the New York waterfront, over 300 miles when you can consider the four great rivers and the docksides and New Jersey shoreline. All of this was very fertile period for Garrett. No more so than in 1920, when the Archbishop of Sydney, Dr. Daniel Maddox, a fierce Roman Catholic supporter of Sinn Féin in Ireland, was stopped on the Baltic ship due to sail for Liverpool. The officers refused to carry him on the ship. What actually happened then over a period of 3 weeks was that there was a massive amount of stoppage on the New York docks. There was a massive amount of support for the Liverpool stokers that had refused to sail the ship if Mannix was not allowed to sail. And of course, it brought into being the American women's support for independence movement, which was predominantly actresses, as they were known at the time. It also brought the black movement in terms of the docks onto into representation onto piers in New York that they've never been represented before. So this Garrett's in New York in 1920 when this takes place. This was an absolute apex of the tradition of culture, politics. You could write about it, literature, and indeed other aspects, including rights of representation. This was hugely important for him, for when he went back to New York, where in 1923 he jumps ship again, and we see a very different photograph of Garret, which is there in the book. It's almost like a scholarly Garret, complete with hair very tidy, in a suit, tie, and looking quite the writer type. And this was what Garret wanted to be known as. He wanted to be known as a writer. The other great sort of his contemporary, James Phelan, sort of when they were both coming off ships and drinking on Bootle Dock Road in the early 1920s, sort of said, George Garret never referred to himself as a stoker. He was a writer. And it's this notion of displacement that makes Garret so interesting. Some people could sort of argue that James Hanley, the other great sort of trilogy of Liverpool Irish writers, was a much more accomplished writer and wrote 40 books. And that's absolutely true. But Hanley didn't quite live the life of Garret. He didn't live the life of the family in the intense dockside parishes. He didn't live the life of... He lived much more of a literary life. He was no less working class than Garret in his upbringing, but he departed from it with his writing. Whereas Garret was writing all the time, but he was still framed by that intense dockside parish. But as Jose Luis Borges used to say, if you want to write about New York, write about Buenos Aires. If you want to write about Liverpool, think of somewhere else in your imagination. It's that sense of displacement that makes Garret such a fascinating character. And that's what we've tried to do in relation to the introduction of the book, which is quite long, to sort of say, look, Garret is not just about this intense dockside parish. The book would lead you to understand, oh yes, that's just the trials and tribulations of a man with a large family in a terribly poor part of a poor city. But it's much more than that. It's much more than that. And Frank Cottrell Boyce, in the introduction to the book, alludes to this fact, whereby on Scotland Road, for example, and on the Dangle, in the old tenements, you would see monkeys and parakeets and parrots, all brought back from various parts of the world, and yet the people living in those areas who didn't go away to sea, including the vast majority of women, were tightly bound by that dockside parish. So it's that juxtaposition between the intense locale and the far horizon that gives Garret his imagination. Not only his imagination, but as a writer working at his trade in almost against impossible odds. And this is why the letters acquired from Texas at the back of the book between himself and John Raymond are so interesting in the way that it describes, that I can't really think of the absolutely day-to-day life of a working writer, not abstracted from his day-to-day circumstances. And I think in some respects it's that notion of the far horizon and the intense day-to-day activity that sort of captures what Garret was about. And in some respects, if you look at, Mike alluded to the fact that he was always championing the seaman, because he was a seaman for so many years, finished his life on the river working. Patrick Neary, who I interviewed in 1987, said very cogently, I got all of my experience from American ships. He was writing about that, and he was talking about the 1950s and the 1960s. Garrett automatically took it and built it into his experience from the 1920s, simply because he was a Democrat, a natural born Democrat, but he was also a cosmopolitan figure. So